Please take your seats. The program will begin momentarily. Please take your seats. The program will begin momentarily. Please take your seats. The program will begin momentarily. Please welcome Executive Vice President of Atlantic Live, Candace Montgomery.
Hello, everyone. As they said, I'm Candace Montgomery, Executive Vice President of Atlantic Live, the team that brings the Atlantic's events to places and spaces like these all over the country. Thank you so much for joining us today for this important gathering here at Washington University's Olin Business School. Today, we will explore how medical breakthroughs, especially in complex fields such as neurological disease, can move from discovery to real-world impact at scale. From translational science to public health innovation and biotech entrepreneurship, this event examines the crucial handoffs between research, implementation, and commercialization. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. We kindly ask you to silence your cell phones, but keep them handy. If something you see or hear today captures your attention, we encourage you to share it with your social network. And please be sure to tag Atlantic Live. Also, don't forget to participate in our poll by scanning the QR code on the screen next to me and behind me throughout the venue space. We'll have one poll question and we'll have another during the break. We will be revealing the results in the program later today. We'd like to thank our underwriter, Washington University's Olin Business School, for their support of the Atlantic's journalism. And now I'd like to welcome to the stage the Dean of Olin Business School, Mike Mazzio.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I'm so excited that everyone is here with us today. Welcome and thank you to our partners at the Atlantic and Candace for kicking us off today. We are so excited to have you here at the Olin Business School at WashU.
Recording in progress.
And we're going to record. We're so excited for that. Before we get into the heart of our program today, I want to talk a little bit about why we drew you all here to a business school to talk about health. And it's related to our Business of Health initiative here at Olin. Of course, WashU and Olin, we're a top-tier university where business expertise and research insights, entrepreneurship, and really pragmatic problem solving where our ideas have impact. And in that spirit, just over a year ago, we at Olin launched a strategic plan in which the business key elements. Our alumni have deep roots in the health sector, with some of our degree programs claiming 1 in 4 students working in health industries. And our alumni from these programs and the many corporate partners that we at a business school can bring together from this region made it clear that we have an opportunity and that there's a need in the health industry that Olin is well positioned, uniquely positioned to meet. We're bringing core business skills to fuel successful and steady growth of ideas and innovation to build better outcomes for patients, improving care delivery systems, and delivering revolutionary breakthroughs to the market. So the Business of Health initiative is about helping to build cross-functional communities, all kinds of health industry professionals who can collaborate and scale solutions to address real challenges in the health industry today. This event is a really important part of how we do that, how we deliver on the promise we see in the business of health. And so in addition to leaving here with a new idea or two, I hope that you take advantage of the community that we've been able to bring together and leave with a connection or two, or 3 or 4 or 5, however many you can get. There will be folks here who can be your partners, and that's what we need to be successful in this space. So thanks again for joining us today, and we're going to get started with our first panel. Good morning, everyone.
For a conversation on thinking bigger, scaling innovation in brain health, please welcome Joyce Balls-Berry, Associate Professor of Neurology at Washington University School of Medicine, Eric Gulvey, Founding CEO of Neuro360, and Timothy Miller, Professor of Neurology at Washington University School of Medicine, with Ian Bogost, contributing writer at The Atlantic.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. At the end of this session, I will be taking questions from the audience, so please keep those in mind as we talk. And with that, let's just jump right in. The topic of this session, the theme of this conversation is brain health, which is a huge topic. It includes advances in ALS, Alzheimer's, epilepsy, mental health, and more. And I want to start by asking if each of you could briefly describe one research advance you're working on or that you're excited about in this area.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Ian, for the first question, and thank you all for being here. I think one of the advances that we've been working on in my lab is really thinking about building a research registry where we have the opportunity to engage with local communities. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, and I was lucky enough to move back home. And in my transition home, I thought about the fact that we don't really have enough representation from all communities in Alzheimer's disease research and even brain health research. So in June 28th, 2023, we launched a research registry for the Knight Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, and we recruited in a little less than a year over 1,000 people into the registry. Our goal is to make sure that that registry is available for all researchers in the ADRD or the Alzheimer's disease and related dementia space, but also in other areas of brain health as well. Our community is ready to have conversations about the historical underpinnings of bad science, where we can allow them the chance to really have a voice in a way that they can change research so that we can increase justice in science as well. So that's one of the things that I'm most proud of, and I think that it can be innovative.
Great. Dr. Galvey.
Yeah, thanks. Good morning, everyone. I'll keep my answer short because I don't run a research lab anymore. It's been a long time since I did that. But I will say that Neuro360, one of the issues that Neuro360 is working on with a large number of researchers is neuroinflammation, the impact of inflammation in the brain to drive a number of different diseases. And at WashU, we've discovered a number of different researchers who are trying to address really important problems by trying to understand the impact of inflammation on all kinds of different diseases, on dementia, multiple sclerosis, even sort of clinical issues, people coming into the ER with stroke and other issues. So it's a pretty widespread and exciting new area of innovation.
Dr. Miller.
I'm also delighted to be here, and thank you for this opportunity. The thing that I'm most excited about is our group is focused on precision medicines for the brain and spinal cord, and broadly for neurological diseases. And we've developed a way to turn off harmful gene products in the brain and spinal cord. And I'll tell you just one small story that's now come out of that work that I've been impressed by, which is many of you know that Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS, is a uniformly fatal disease that leads to weakness of the arms, legs, breathing, speaking, swallowing. It typically runs about 3 to 5 years. And in a small genetic subset, 2% of all ALS, in a clinical trial, we're able to shut down the genetic cause of that particular form of ALS. And in that group, what we find is that 25% of people in that study stabilize completely, or in fact improve in their strength at 2 years and even out at 3 years. And so the expected number, I think you just heard me say this, the expected number is 0. And so now I think we're onto something in terms of finding therapies for neurodegenerative diseases.
So Dr. Miller, it's an incredible result. How do you take that opportunity, that treatment or clinical method, and make it available more broadly to the people who would benefit from it? What are the obstacles and opportunities in so doing right now?
Yeah, so that's a large question in terms of thinking about how do we, in fact, looking at some of these questions, we could spend hours discussing this. I'll try to keep my answers short and to the point. I think one of the challenges for ALS and rare neurodegenerative diseases first is getting the diagnosis. So the SOD1, or this particular genetic form of ALS, 300 people in the United States. All ALS, 30,000 people in the United States. Still rare. Parkinson's 1 million, Alzheimer's disease 6 million. So when you're talking about rare diseases, many people have never seen a case of ALS in their practice. And so getting the diagnosis first. So people in the community maybe 6 or 9 months with weakness and other complaints before they get to a specialist who recognizes it as ALS. So I guess that's the first step. The next is genetic testing. The therapy we've developed is for those with a particular genetic form of the disease. So you need genetic testing. Having that widely available and having that widely available genetic testing be utilized for people to get that genetic diagnosis for that therapy. So those are the focuses on that particular form. And then the delivery method, it's delivered by lumbar puncture, so that's a little bit more complicated than usual. So there's each of those steps has some challenges for the healthcare system. And then how would you scale that broadly is an even bigger question.
Right. Well, Dr. Galvey, you mentioned your organization, which is called Neuro360. It's kind of like an incubator for connecting researchers, the industry, the healthcare workforce, the community. What has been your approach to helping solve these scalability and rollout problems?
Yeah, we're trying to bring together a lot of different elements that are required to move early stage discoveries out of the lab into the hands of either a startup company or a large corporation, and then progress through the very long series of studies that need to be done to bring a drug from an idea, published paper, out of an academic lab all the way to the market. It's an arduous journey. It typically can cost hundreds of millions of dollars. And what we're trying to do is connect academic researchers to people who understand different elements of that process that are critical to moving things forward. So that would include individuals that have worked in industry who understand, well, if you want to move this idea forward, what kinds of experiments do you have to do? What's the most critical experiment? To investors, someone has to back this concept. What are they looking for? Their understanding of market need and how they deploy their capital, what they're looking for. To entrepreneurs, who is going to drive this if something exits the university and becomes a startup company? Who actually knows how to run money, do strategic planning, get milestones defined, reach those milestones on what are pretty limited amounts of money? And clinicians. We have to connect basic researchers to clinicians to ensure that they understand when they think, well, this is what I need to do to fix that disease, that they actually have the perspective of a clinician. And then we need the capital, the risk capital. And there's been a fundamental shift in industry in the US over the last several decades that I would say probably the vast majority of the American public and very few academics understand. When I was in industry, I was in the pharmaceutical industry for 14 years. When I was working in industry read those papers. I led new target teams that read papers and said, this might be a target for diabetes. Do we want to prosecute this one or that one or that one? And then we had the wherewithal, the backing to start working on those early stage ideas and advance them forward. And that's an exponential risk curve. So the paper that was just published out of a lab starts here, and as you progress through preclinical studies and then through clinical studies, the drop-off is exponential in terms of failure. Pharma, big med device companies used to fund all of that. They don't do that anymore. They shifted out of doing internal research. Now they pay a high price if you've driven something all the way through into clinical trials. But there is very little money available to drive those early stage ideas.
You know, you've brought up the question of funding, which, for those of you who don't know, we are living in a what I might gently call a challenging funding environment. Federal funding, including the NIH, is responsible for something like $750 million of annual research at our host, Washington University. And that money has been, as you've noted, disrupted. Are there new opportunities that arise as a result of this challenge for commercialization?
Yeah, they are. They're not trivial. Universities are now trying to partner with pharma companies, med device companies to fund some of the research that they're interested in pursuing and trying to push across that early translational research barrier. There are new accelerators, for example, that focus on subsets of science like neuroscience, but they're really a drop in the bucket. There are philanthropies, that's another option to raise money for that. Most philanthropies focus on funding academic research, again, because most people don't understand that gap. And so the assumption is if I fund the critical research, everything after that is fine. You just take it out of the lab and you sort of just manufacture it and you've got a product. And it doesn't work the system does not work that way.
So money is always an obstacle. Another is access and equity. Dr. Balsbury, this is an area of focus for you. I think a lot of Americans, ordinary Americans, are familiar with the idea that the healthcare industry can frustrate equitable access. And I wonder if you can just tell us an example that you've run into in your work, especially maybe one that you think you've chipped away at a solution for.
Thank you so much for the question. So I think one of the things that we've really noticed in the work that I've been doing for the last, oh my gosh, I'm going to age myself, almost 30 years. But, you know, I don't lie about my age, so it is what it is. But I think that one of the things that we've really been able to impart is the ability to identify community needs and patients' needs. So a bulk of my work in our lab really focuses on asking communities what they actually want in terms of healthcare, and then helping them identify questions to ask and then reminding them that it's okay to switch healthcare providers or healthcare teams. The other thing that we've been really working on is making sure that community members are research ready for clinical trials. That is, I just submitted a grant to the federal government. I don't know if that's going to happen. Like right now, the government is shut down. So we just submitted a grant to really think about ways we can do more with the registry in order to make sure that our study partners and participants in, or the registrants, are ready to engage in research in a way that they understand what questions to ask. We think about research literacy, we think about functional literacy, whether or not someone can read or write. We think about health literacy and understanding health information. And health research literacy is the ability of that participant to understand every aspect of what they're being asked to do if they're participating in any type of study, be it observational, be it cohort. So those cross-sectional studies that might be one-time events with surveys, but even clinical trials or device trials, or a drug trial, what does that look like? What are the side effects? What do I need to ask? And I think we've done a really good job of starting to build a cohort of people here in our local community that are ready to engage with science. The thing that we are struggling with is how many studies are ready to enroll. And that's an equity issue on the opposite side. You know, we have, so St. Louis is I'm from here, I think I said that. So if you think about deep North City, where the tornado kind of really was devastating, there are no hospitals over there, there's no clinics. So what we've been doing is what we call decentralized research. So we go directly into the community, where community members live, and we're also in the process of trying to do some of our other Alzheimer's trials that are run by like John Morris at the Night ADRC. We have a study called Compass, and all of the research happens at a community center. For my registry, most of the data collection happened in the community. You go where people are. So, you know, the challenge with some of the clinical trials is, okay, we've got to do a blood draw, we need to do an MRI, we need to do all of these other things. So how do we make sure that the community members that we need to engage and the patients that are at greatest risk or carry the greatest disease burden are able to get to WashU, or for WashU to come to them? And I push researchers for us to go to where the community is.
And if I could add to that, Joy is a colleague of ours at Neuro360. One of the other things we think about within Neuro360 is the availability, the gap in specialist expertise available to different communities. Yes. So our underserved urban communities, there's a tremendous disparity in the number of practicing neurologists. Likewise, in our rural communities here in Missouri and across the entire country. And so one of the things we think about is, can we identify technologies that can be utilized by the non-experts in stroke and in dementia and movement disorders? How can we find technologies that make it simpler to be able to provide expert care, but without having that expert located everywhere you need the care?
So this is essentially a scalability solution to a
Definitely.
problem of lost
Absolutely.
expertise
Yeah.
or missing expertise.
Definitely. That's one of the things that we've been trying to figure out as well. You know, you think about mammography, right? And there with breast cancer, and the mobile units go out to the community. We haven't had as much in that space in terms of neuroscience, and I'm hoping that through Neuro360 and some of the other partnerships that we'll be able to bring some of those tools for neuroscience and brain health to the community. I'm hopeful.
What about the role of health systems, regulators, these kind of big bureaucratic organizations? This is not my area, but I have had the opportunity in my career to work on some consulting for digital healthcare interventions, and I was just shocked, although perhaps not surprised, to learn how intractable, you know, the constraints of whether it's board expectations or the way that Medicare works can have on impact. What are some problems in that area and solutions that you've identified?
Jim, I don't know if I can hand that, toss that off to my
Miller, you've been
clinician.
I'm happy to jump in. It's an enormous problem, right? And so and there's so many different levels that kind of hard to start in. I mean, some of the problems that I think about in the neurodegenerative disease space are we want systems that reward the specialist for spending that extra time and seeing people. And the way that the systems are set up, and universities and others struggle with this, is the ALS clinic, the dementia clinic, all these clinics that are focused on these specialty care, multidisciplinary clinics, in general, are going to be money-losing enterprises, right? And so that's a systems issue, and universities and other places can try to fix that through a variety of ways and fill in with philanthropy and other things, but that's a systems issue. And so what we want, is I think we want systems that reward that expertise and that bring and then funnel that in. And the other, you mentioned this already in terms of some of the systems and having expertise in the community. Why is there not expertise in the community? Why does it take a long time to get diagnosed with ALS? We've heard about some of those solutions or other neurodegenerative diseases. It's because there aren't those experts. And so how could we enable that and thinking about those systems? So those are just two things that come to mind. The solutions are challenging.
More difficult.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just add, without giving you that answer that you're looking for, I can say that within my organization, BioSTL, we recruit companies that have already developed technologies in their home countries, international companies looking to land somewhere in the U.S. to start selling their products. And the group that's driving that, the global health group within BioSTL, some of their primary customers are our healthcare systems, the insurers, and the payers. So they're trying to present technologies to those who need to buy it or want to pilot it. And so they're trying to get that feedback directly from our community here in St. Louis and across the greater Midwest.
So this is a very slow process. It's expensive, it's slow, it's bureaucratized, as I mentioned, which is quite a bit different than the way that we think about innovation in other sectors. It's supposed to be fast and lithe and move quickly, and that's just kind of not possible in medicine, and especially in complicated specialties such as brain medicine. So what's the answer there? Like, how do we make progress in seeding innovation and investment and entrepreneurship that would roll this stuff out while tolerating the different time horizons that investment demands?
Yeah, I mean, there isn't a simple answer. Every innovation that we come across is unique. It's got different issues that have to be addressed, but I think we ultimately need that early stage risk capital I referred to earlier in my remarks, because that's what drives the collection of enough evidence that those with more capital would be willing to come in and follow on. And so that starts with the translational research that's occurring inside the university before anyone has any interest in licensing that intellectual property. We need more funding for translational research, and then we need more funding to drive those early stage activities in companies. And that's not the kind of funding that comes from for-profit investors because of that risk curve that I referred to. So we need new ways to fund that. BioSTL and its investment arm, BioGenerator, is structured as a nonprofit, so it can take high risk early on and create a funnel that looks at a large number of ideas and then narrows them down to those that are making sufficient progress and look like they have commercial legs. And that's what gets presented to the follow-on investors.
Why don't we take some questions from the audience at this time? There's one in the back there. Do we have a mic running? Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on points made by Dr. Ballsbury and Dr. Galve regarding access. One of the biggest things with neurologic disease I think about when I think of access, my mom had epilepsy. She couldn't drive because they take your license away for at least 6 months when you have a seizure. That means it's nearly impossible to get transportation to specialized care if you don't live in an area with public transportation. It also makes it just about impossible to pick up your medications from the pharmacy if you're the only adult in the house. So I'm curious, in both of your work, how you consider transportation and what steps you've taken to address that access barrier.
Well, thank you so much for the question. My mother also had epilepsy, so this was real for my brother and I, because at one point she was living alone, and I was in Minnesota, and my brother was on the East Coast. And we were lucky enough that we were able to hire drivers for her. And at one point, she just decided not to drive anymore. However, when she started having seizures, that became a bigger issue because at that time, the legislation was 1 year without your license. And so if you can imagine someone who wants to be very independent losing all of their independence and having to ask for help, we were also lucky because at that time my dad was still alive. But to answer your question, what we do in my lab is, and also what our Memory Diagnostic Center does, is we will provide transportation. It is a cost that you sometimes cannot put on a federal grant. So it is important that we have discretionary funds sometimes to cover those costs. It is something that I feel is necessary. And that's another reason that I like for us to go to where people are, because there are times when patients will be open to us coming to their homes. So that is another way as well. But you're right, transportation is an issue. It is a burden. And then if you do, like some of the labs in neurology will do black car services, they don't give a discount just because we're WashU and have a nonprofit status and all of that. Their cost is their cost, and we have to figure out ways to cover it. In the past, I've done partnerships with local taxi services for discounted rates to cover the cost of even our community partners for our advisory board so that they could be present. I had a board member when I was in my previous role at Mayo Clinic who had could not drive at all because of vision. And we covered the cost of her taxi service. And the taxi company gave us a discounted rate to make sure that this community partner could be present at all of our activities. So we will provide transportation when funds is available.
Yeah, and I'll just add briefly, that's one element of something that we refer to as wraparound services. It is the cost of what has to be paid for in order to engage people in the work that we do. And so we try to build that into our budget. We do the same in our workforce activities for Neuro 360 as you think about trying to get people who haven't been engaged in the biotech workforce and trying to give them the training in order to be able to enter into this workforce. You have to factor in all of those services that people need in order to get that training. Fortunately, in the workforce space, there's more money available from grants. I think there's growing recognition of that need, but it's something we have to factor in all the time.
I'll just jump in real quick and add that when we did a survey of people who participate in clinical trials, we noticed the rural community doesn't participate as much. And the main barrier on that was transportation. Yep. They just can't get to see us. And so a bunch of neurologists sit around trying to figure out, well, what are we going to do about that? I'm not sure we came up with any great ideas, but maybe the best was a new philanthropic organization staffed by volunteers who have us linked to the disease. And it's complicated though. Because you need wheelchair vans and other things. But I think there is an opportunity, and perhaps a business school is the place to talk about it. There is an opportunity for somebody to help figure out that transportation. And I think that the community of people who've been affected by ALS, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, all these different neurodegenerative diseases, they'd be willing to give back and help with this in terms of their time. So.
Let's take one more question from the audience here.
Hi, my name's Liza Lockwood. I'm the former chair of the medical toxicology section at the School of Medicine, and I left for, I'm the medical affairs lead at Bayer Crop Science now. So I've seen both sides of this, and I think this is a really interesting time in terms of funding because of all of the situation at NIH. I'm very interested in learning more about how to do public-private partnerships, but the one sort of rate-limiting factor in that is that there is a deep suspicion coming from the academy and also the general public about the intentions of pharma. And we saw how that all went with COVID, especially when you're talking about accelerating research and doing very interesting, coming up with very interesting, innovative ideas like the mRNA vaccine or gene editing for things like ALS or all of the things that we're talking about. When you accelerate that research, there's a pushback that the research was done too quickly and that big pharma has an undue influence. So how do we start, one, building trust back between the academy and companies, and then also bringing that trust to the general public?
Y'all want me to? Okay. So thank you so much for that question, and thank you so much for what you've done in the academy and also what you're doing in industry. So I think one of the things that we talk a lot about within community engaged research is the fact that we need to have the hard conversations. And that starts with trust and respect. And that starts with also acknowledging, bad science, right? And what I mean by that is unethical treatments of different communities, be it rural populations, be it communities in urban core. And we can even think about the stories here, even in St. Louis, where mosquito repellent was sprayed in communities of color, and those people are now dying from cancer, COPD, asthma, and the like, and they're still alive. Some of them are still alive. And so that hurts us, right? So when discoveries happen quickly, like the COVID-19 vaccine, people are skeptical because they've watched people in their communities become sick. So I think that what we have to do is acknowledge when the academy has hurt people. And then in that acknowledgement, bring the patients to the table, bring the community partner to the table when you're having the conversations about the creation of a new device or a new drug or a new opportunity to help. Because what we might think is going to be helpful might not be what they want. And I think that Eric has done an amazing job with Neuro 360 because we have an entire community engagement area where we bring patients, where we bring community partners to the table to talk about discovery and that translation to the public. And so I think if we acknowledge the past, talk about every step that we're doing, and answer the hard questions, it builds trust and it also increases respect.
I can jump in real quick. So I think that's awesome in what you guys are doing in terms of building respect, and that answers part of that question. And the other was really about what about those relationships, and how are those going? And say my experience in those public, private relationships with companies and seeing companies is that it's all really good. Like it's needed. It's everybody's on the same page. We're all going for the same idea, which is to find cures for people. And so I'm very optimistic about those relationships and how those are going. And I think they're very well managed by universities at this point. There's everything is declared, everything's out in the open. So I'm very optimistic. There are going to be circumstances where there are failures, and I hear that. And then those need to be managed well and help people understand that that's one example of a problem, but mostly going exceedingly well.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. That really helped the point I was going to make. But I think a big part of it is developing the entrepreneurial culture, fostering that within the research universities so people understand that there are common goals, that really different groups can work together as long as they keep the essential pieces in mind. The patient, keep the patient first and foremost. What are we doing to drive research forward as quickly as possible, but with as deep and careful attention as we can? And I think there's been a huge shift in the entrepreneurial culture in universities with sort of, let's call it the new generation. People are far more interested in understanding that their work has the possibility of making a big impact in the population, curing diseases, creating diagnoses. And so I think we're seeing that culture shift, and you need to get people together who come from different backgrounds and have those thoughts, well, they do this or they do that, and just get them together and talk about what are really the essential things that they're trying to do. In the time I spent in pharma, I worked with people from dozens and dozens of different disciplines, and what I took away from that is I met an unbelievable group of people who were dedicated to working as hard as they could because they wanted to address disease. And I think if you get those people together from different backgrounds, that will ultimately come out.
Well, one other last quick comment is that on many of the clinical trials that that I'm involved with, or at least in the ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease space, there are people with lived experience participating in in thinking about setting that up. So as that trial is presented, there's somebody typically who has ALS, who's been affected by ALS, who has a voice, and that's intentional, and more so intentional, and I think that's an important part of it.
Yeah, I think that it's about thinking about the shared value. The goal of biomedical research, what? It's to improve quality of life and human health, right? If we're thinking about it in terms of those spaces. And by giving the voice to the patient, the caregiver, the local healthcare provider, people in the rural communities and in other areas where there isn't access, I think changes the way that we do research. It also changes the way we do entrepreneurship. It gives us the opportunity to really think about discovery in a way that is just, there was a image years ago with clinical and translational science that said it took 25 years from the bench to the public. And what we're doing now is trying to shrink that by looking at that shared value, by bringing patients and community members and caregivers to the table. That allows us to shrink that time. And that allows us to have the shared values, respect, and trust.
Doctors, thank you so much for sharing your experience and expertise with us today. It's just been fantastic. I know we've just scratched the surface.
Thank you.
For a conversation produced by our underwriter, Washington University's Olin Business School, on Universities at the Front Lines, Catalyzing the Next Wave of Health Innovation, please welcome Bobby Sandage, Managing Director at the Paula and Roger Riney Foundation and Lightchain Capital LLC, Hal Barron, Founder and CEO of Altos Labs, and Aaron Scott, Senior Lecturer at MIT Sloan, with Dean Mike Mazzio.
Thank you, everyone. And I believe Hal is joining us remotely here as well, so that we can see him. Welcome, Hal. And thanks for being here, panelists. Universities at the Front Lines is the title of our panel. And we're living in an incredible period of medical advancement. More discovery is happening now than at any time in recent history, but discovery is just the start. In this conversation, we want to explore the role of universities in bringing these incredible innovations to real people so they make a difference. And in our first question, I'm going to start with you, Aaron, and then ask each of the panelists to respond. When you look at the state of healthcare innovation today, what do you see as the biggest challenges in moving from a promising idea to a scalable solution that really impacts patients?
Thank you. And it's such a pleasure to be back here in St. Louis. I started my career here at McKelvey and Biogenerator and Nidus and of course Olin. And a big part of that was really how do we move ideas out in the world. And it's important to remember that universities are just such a powerhouse in the strength of innovation in the United States. And so how can we help them to do better? And one challenge is really how do we move from basic science to bedside? And I would say one of the biggest challenges is that this is a long flywheel, as the folks in this room know. And the choices that are made in those earliest decisions, in the earliest process in basic science are going to shape those technologies. They're going to shape whether that technology ends up on a bedside and which bedside it ends up in. And so how can we bring more context to those decisions, to those decision makers, and incentives and resources that really allow them to bring their ideas to those bedsides.
Yeah,
moving
really,
forward.
really interesting. The importance of these early decisions in that long flywheel. Hal, can you chime in here and talk about one or two of the challenges that you experienced in this realm?
Yeah, wonderful to be here virtually anyway. Yeah, my experience has been as an engineer at WashU a long time ago, and then spending a little time in academia, and then been in industry for quite a long time. The challenges I think faced by industry or the pharma industry or biotech actually are very different, I think, than the challenges that are faced by academics. And it's appreciating that those challenges are actually non-overlapping. There's a big opportunity for, I think, academia and industry to collaborate to obviate the challenges each might have. I think in the pharma industry, the biggest challenge from getting an idea to a patient is that, first of all, from the idea to actually getting a drug or something that starts clinical testing, that's hard enough. But when you think about the challenges once you're in the clinic, 90% of drugs that enter the clinic fail to ever help a patient. Somewhere along the phase 1, 2, 3 pipeline, they end up failing. And they fail actually usually for lack of efficacy. Sometimes it's toxicity, sometimes there's other reasons. And that failure is oftentimes because there wasn't a deep understanding of the biology behind the target or the pathophysiologic state of the disease. Something done incredibly well in academia, not done so well in industry, where the focus is more on translating the basic science. In academia, the challenges are different. There's an enormous amount of focus on the basic science, the insights about the pathophysiology of a given disease. But in academia, there isn't the financial resources or the expertise to overcome that chasm of failure in the translational stage. So to me, there's a real opportunity to complement each other by having the best of academia, the best of industry, where you can have deep understandings of biology, and then you can have the operational effectiveness, the regulatory expertise, the translational expertise that you see in industry to really bring about pretty significant change. The last thing I'd say is that one of the really outstanding features of academics is that they are given to some extent the freedom and have the intellectual capacity to really think quite big, think about transformational ideas. They often fail, but the idea starts with doing something really big. That luxury, that opportunity is often missing in the pharma industry because of the nature of the quarter by quarter earnings calls and things like that, where incremental science is actually seen as lower risk and more viable path forward. But again, we can talk about this later, but combining the best of academia and industry, I think it's a perfect time for this, and I think it overcomes some of the limitations of each system.
Thanks, Hal. And as we proceed, I'd love you to bring in more about what you're doing at Altos to address some of those issues and the experiment that you guys are undertaking in that regard. I'll turn to you, Bobby, and ask about kind of challenges from your perspective.
So just to build on what Hal said, I agree. Industry and academia relationships should be stronger. And one of the things that I think would help a lot because of the challenges of failure is if academia could advance these products or ideas further to take a little more risk out of it before it gets in the hands. There was a study published a few years ago at about a 20-year period where they showed that if industry worked with academia, the success rate going from preclinical to phase 1 to phase 2, it ranged in every category. If they worked together, it was an improvement in success rates. It ranged from 7% early on all the way up to phase 3, and it was a 63% increase in success of a drug finally getting to the market, and when there was a collaboration versus no collaboration.
That's really powerful. And research-based evidence to justify why we're all here, I think, today, and how we can kind of build new structures to help execute on that, and how it's a good opportunity to go back to you. Talk a little bit about, the next question was about new approaches, and solving this issues or addressing some of these issues around alignment. So I wondered if you could kind of bring your experience to kind of understanding that and maybe give us an example.
Yeah, let me just riff off the last comment, because to put the 63% in perspective, the average pharma company has about a 10% success rate, as I mentioned, entering the clinic to get to a patient. If you were to double that from 10% to 20% consistently, you would be the best biotech pharma on the planet if you could consistently do 20%. So going from 10 to, 16 or 17, just by simply leveraging the expertise of each other, I would argue a relatively trivial thing to put in place. There are challenges, and I'll go through those in a minute, but that would be such a transformation of our industry. And there's no reason, in my opinion, why this isn't something we should all advance aggressively. So at Altos, our model, which is incredibly unique, is to get the best of academia and the best of industry together under one for-profit model to tackle one of the biggest problems facing the planet, which is why we get sick as we get older. We always assume that because you get older, you're just going to get disease. But the question is really why? Why is age one of the strongest predictors for getting virtually every disease? Not every disease, but almost every disease. And of course, time isn't modifiable. We know that from physics. But the point is, could we modify some of the resilience mechanisms that are present when you're young that seem to erode when you get older? And this big idea, the idea that you could maybe slow down this process of aging, this lack of buffer capacity, resilience that accompanies aging, if you could slow that down, the impact on human disease would be transformational. Possibly even the ability to reverse diseases is part of our mission. To do that, we secured a very, very large amount of funding, I think more than any other company ever in biotech history, $3 billion out of the gate, and hired directly out of academia a large number of brilliant, very committed academics who care deeply about turning science into medicines, to put their incredibly creative brains together with the best and brightest of industry, who can take that science and translate it. And unlike a typical sort of pharma academic relationship, which usually starts with, hey, I saw you created some interesting IP, can I buy it? And then they take it and then they try to generalize the findings and all the challenges that follow that. We've decided just to bring in brilliant people without any pre-existing IP and just let it be almost like a university, in the sense that we'll be doing really interesting basic science. And when those observations become compelling enough, we can get into what that means, but then we leverage the expertise of industry in collaboration with these brilliant scientists that discovered these innovative novel pathways or opportunities to reverse disease, together develop those. And we think, even tackling one of the hardest problems that we could think of, which is aging, we think this model is going to be very successful and hopefully be a guideline for how maybe other pharma biotechs can collaborate with prestigious academic institutions like WashU, where you have not only the brilliant scientists, but you have an engineering school with a creative way of thinking about problems from that perspective, and a business school and a law school, and basically leveraging all the necessary features of from discovery through translation and commercialization of important medicines.
Thanks for sharing that, Hal, and it's so exciting to see that work emerging, and we'll be following your progress in Altos. Aaron, I know you've just recently published a book that kind of looks at this space. Tell us what you've seen in terms of either changes or approach that can help with this alignment.
Yeah, well, thank you for shamelessly plugging my book for me. I appreciate that. Available at bookstores now. Entrepreneurship, Choice, and Strategy. Thank you. I want to really continue this great point that Hal and Bobby are building on, that innovation, especially in the healthcare space, is a team sport. And the team that gets you started is not necessarily the team that finishes it. And it is a long journey, and we need incentives alignment, and we need really bringing that together. And so some of the things that we talk about in the book, but also more broadly, is that innovation in these sectors, it is coming from specialists brought together. This is not a world where we want a whole bunch of generalists wearing all hats. What we want to bring is the people with deep knowledge across many different disciplines together in the room to move these innovations forward. There's a lot of great innovation or research that shows this in the strategy literature, that these are where the breakthrough ideas come together, is teams of individuals with deep knowledge. And so some of the things that we've seen that have really been helpful in moving this forward is, how can we not make everyone a generalist in entrepreneurship, but just like the prior panel was talking about at the end, how can we bring entrepreneurship and perspective earlier into that journey? And so some of the things we've done at MIT is, let's have our researchers do sabbaticals at pharma, or do sabbaticals at VC firms, so they're seeing that pathway, and vice versa. How can we bring, just really the decision scientists and the others into the clinical setting, our students exposed at all different journeys, or have our business students sitting in the classroom next to our medical students and our postdocs. As well as, and this is your point, is how can we also have more flexibility for our PhD students and our postdocs when they are ready to move that innovation forward through commercialization, but they're not quite ready for prime time in the next stage of funding? How can we create lab space and time for them to de-risk that, so that that technology really reaches its full potential when we hand it over or move to that next step with folks like Hal and Bobby?
Yeah. Bobby, chime in there to Hal and Aaron's ideas.
So I'm going to take a little different tack.
Okay.
And look at it from the venture capital point of view. When we make investments in startups, there are two things that we look at. The technology has to be sound and reasonable and that sort of thing, but it's the team that you're really betting on, because you don't know whether the technology is going to work or not. So having the right people around the table, the founder, the people that's been there, done that, and then the support people behind it, it's very critical for us to make a decision to make an investment in a brand new startup, brand new idea.
Yeah, and that experience, I just bring it back to you for a second, Aaron, and that experience, how does that kind of connect to this point you're making about generalists versus specialists?
Yeah, I think, we need the general context. And
Yep.
so having folks bring their expertise into what is that process, what is, when I'm at T-1 of a breakthrough idea, like Hal was talking about, I am making choices that are going to shape that technology, both its potential, but also its ability to interface. And so if I can, as a specialist, understand the trade-offs I'm making, no one is going to better understand the scientific choices. But if I can start to understand what that means for the downstream partners or downstream applications, that's where I need to be interfacing with folks like Hal and Bobby and clinicians and payers through that whole, to start so that I can make informed choices at that earliest stage.
Yeah, and again, I think I'm counting mentally how many times Erin has said the word early.
Yes.
in her answers, and I think that kind of leads to my wrap up question, because unfortunately we're running out of time here a little bit. We're thinking about the current innovation landscape, where there has been certainly a lot of changes. I wondered if each of you could comment to wrap us up on how academia needs to change in light of kind of the current landscape. And we'll start with Hal, and then Bobby, and then Aaron, you can wrap us up.
That's a great question. Let me, Aaron mentioned a lot about teams. Let me say that I think academia is a wonderful place to do basic science. And in the current model, you don't necessarily need to translate your science to change medicine to be successful. And I think that's fine. For those in academia or academic institutions that do want to make a very big dent in not just science, but medicine, and make this this really difficult decision to become a integrated organization that turns science into medicine, you need to change, I think, the incentives a little bit. You know, it's fine to reward people on a paper or a discovery, but the reward systems for an individual sport are very different than a team sport. And I think that for those in academia who want to play on this team sport, they should be incentivized to do so. It's great if they just have an internal passion to do so. That's of course critical and necessary, but it'd be nice to see that a subgroup of people in academia might be able to branch off or create an environment where they can form these partnerships with industry. And rather than think about it as two separate teams, Erin, I would encourage you to think about it as one team with different skill sets. You know, there's people who play offense, there's people who play defense. Both should have deep respect for each other's skill set. And when you realize that you're part of a really incredible team that's going to do incredible things, you start to give up your individual sense of need for recognition, and you're playing because of the impact of what your team could do. And so the more academia, for those in academics who find this to be a really exciting sport, turning science into medicines, having an environment with incentives and structure so that they can play what is, in my opinion, the most exciting game in science, which is to help patients.
Bobby.
So I think Hal hit on it, the right incentives inside the university. But I'm going to, again, take a little bit different tack and quote some data. In the 20 years period from 2000 to 2021, 21 years, 80% of the new drugs for multiple myeloma came out of academia. So those researchers are doing something right. Almost 70% of the melanoma new treatments that got approved by FDA came out of academia, had an inventor. 50% of lymphomas, 29% of infectious disease, 0 in pain, anesthesia, and hormone treatments came out of academia. So I think there's some learnings from the people that have been successful in moving those ideas, those compounds or therapies from the lab all the way to the marketplace. So there's some things there that we need to sort out and exploit, if you will. And academia has the ability, because there's some academic centers that are doing it very successfully.
Great. And Erin, last word here for the panel.
Yes, well, I would say, I just want to echo what everyone is saying, is that universities are a powerhouse of innovation, and they are a powerhouse of helping patients. And as we continue to refine that in more complex technology spaces and regulatory spaces and bring those forwards, remembering that we are on the shared team, as Hal was saying, and really thinking about a lot of flexible incentives and structures that move that forward. There is no one singular playbook for commercialization, and there is no singular playbook from the bench to the bedside. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you to Erin, Hal, and Bobby for this exciting panel.
Here to discuss building better health together, cross-sector collaboration that works, please welcome Alexander Garza, Chief Community Health Officer at SSM Health, Karen Joint-Maddox, Professor at Washington University School of Medicine and School of Public Health, and Sophia Poole, Assistant Vice President of Planning and Operations at the St. Louis Integrated Health Network, with Jean Meserve, contributor at Atlantic Live.
Thanks. Great to be with all of you and with you. I want to start by jumping into these poll results. I hope all of you voted. We asked, what's the biggest barrier to creating cross-sector collaborations that deliver real health results? And here is what you guys said. At 50%, institutional systems that de-incentivize partnership, 40% stakeholders infrequently connect due to longstanding silos, and coming in number 3 was funding gaps, which was kind of a surprise to me. And I want to ask you guys for your reactions and whether you would have ranked the barriers the same way. Karen, why don't I start with you?
I hate to go against the crowd, but I think I probably would have ranked funding gaps a little bit higher. I work in the Medicare policy space, and I think what we see pretty constantly is that there's a fundamental disconnect between where the money is and how the money flows, and what we all know to be sort of the right way to deliver care, the right way to innovate around care. So to me, funding gaps are sort of, maybe it's not funding gaps, maybe it's funding priorities, are a pretty long-standing problem in terms of the policy being behind where we see the innovation moving in terms of both clinical care delivery and in sort of more technological innovation.
Sophia, what about you? Do you agree with this?
I think I agree, but I see stakeholders infrequently connect due to longstanding silos at 40%, and I actually probably would have ranked that above the 50% ranking. And I think it's just, simply because my work at the IHN and other opportunities that I have experience in, we often work together with community-based organizations and systems. And a lot of times, those institutions are not interconnected, and we experience a lot of fragmentation. And so there are a lot of different gaps that occur there that keep the conversation from being on the same level in certain instances. So when I saw that, I was like, okay, I kind of agree with that. Yeah.
Dr. Garza.
Yeah, I think I didn't participate in the poll, so I apologize, but I think I would have answered yes. So, and because
yes,
all of
meaning
these,
all of the above, or yes,
and the reason why I say that is health and healthcare is incredibly complex. And so being able to rank, order, or silo things into simple answers is very challenging. So as we all know, we spend a lot of money on healthcare in this country. And so when we talk about funding, it's like, okay, so what are we talking about funding? Are we talking about funding for healthcare? Are we talking about funding for research? Are we talking about funding for, let's be specific about what that is. It's not really a healthcare system, it's a system of systems, which creates silos and de-incentivizes partnerships in different industry or different professions. But the health of the country is incredibly intertwined between economics, the delivery of healthcare, social issues, all of these different things. So it's really hard to summarize that into, if we only did this one thing, everything would be great.
Are there some additional things not mentioned in the survey that you would see as obstructing collaboration? Let's say people protecting their rice bowls, let's say capacity variations, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. You spoke about people protecting their rice bowls, and oftentimes in working with different community organizations or institutions, like I've been in the room where an individual or an executive director has said, like, let's be honest, I want my piece of the pie to do the work, and yes, it is in service of the greater good, but there is a level of protection there that some organizations and institutions have with their resources, and so I see that as a really big hindrance for us moving the needle forward, whether it is in health and healthcare and impacting different communities that we wish to serve. So I've been in the room where I've heard people say, I want my piece of the pie. So it's kind of difficult to hear, especially as we're working towards transformation in the St. Louis region and beyond.
Karen, some other impediments?
I think a big one, this is my own personal bias, is data. We all are speaking different languages and we talk about these things, and I'd say not only are we're not even really a system of systems, we're sort of a system of accidents, right? Like we have a hospital in this area, not this area, because someone decided that's where they could make enough money. Now, that's maybe not an economic accident, but it's sort of a moral and social accident, right? We don't actually have a system that sits together as a system, and we don't have a data system that sits together as a system. So we're not even speaking the same language generally when we're talking about where is the money, what is a health system, what is healthcare? Probably the biggest, investments or most efficient investments we could make in health are not in health. They're in poverty alleviation. So, we don't even know what we're talking about necessarily when we're talking about these things. So language and data and systems, that was 3 answers.
Dr. Garza, I'm wondering what experiences have made it clear to you that solutions in the health realm have to be cross-sector?
Well, this will come as a surprise to nobody, but I think the COVID-19 pandemic really showed us what the possibilities are when we collaborate. I'm being a little bit, I don't want to toot my own horn or the horn of the community, but we did. But I think we did a really nice job in addressing the challenges of the pandemic through our pandemic task force. And that wasn't just me, even though I was on camera quite a bit. It was really the group that was behind that, and that was the collaboration between the healthcare systems, the major healthcare systems in St. Louis, the politicians, public health, the business community. We had a lot of people that were stakeholders in that. And in many ways, it was challenging because it was a pandemic, it was a deadly pandemic. In many ways, it was simple also because it was a single issue that we could all focus on and drive towards. But I do think that was an example of what we can do when we all work together. It's unfortunate that it takes a deadly pandemic to figure that out.
Sophia, what do you think the possibilities are when it comes to cross-sector collaboration?
I think the possibilities are endless when it comes to cross-sector collaboration, especially when we can do it well, do it right, and we put, whatever, political agendas or personal agendas to the side. If we really keep the North Star, I like to say we keep the main thing, which in our case, it's the people and it's the community and it's our region. And so I think that there's so much here in St. Louis. We have a deep bench of resources. We have a deep bench of wonderful people, wonderful organizations that are brilliant, right? That can really put innovative ideas on the table. And so what would it look like also if we brought community into that decision-making table to help to build those solutions? And I think that sometimes it takes, these big institutions and even some community organizations to take a back seat and allow community at the forefront to help to, drive those changes forward. So I think innovation and collaboration is endless, transformative, but we have to be able to be willing to do it the right way.
Dr. Garza, I'm wondering if there's a lot of pulsing of the community to figure out what their priorities are, what they need, what they want in terms of medical care. Is it transferable? Can you scale that? Or is something that's true in one community maybe not so true in another community?
Yeah, so the best example I have, and many people in the room understand this, is every 3 years, IRS mandates not-for-profit healthcare to do a community health needs assessment. And so we do a lot of work in polling the community and polling our partners to understand what does the community think is most important when it comes to healthcare or to the health of the community, and separate those two words. And the results you get back are very geographically diverse. So St. Louis City is very different than North County, which is very different than South County, which is very different than St. Charles and Jefferson County. Different populations, different needs. But the things that they come back with us to aren't necessarily about delivery of health care. Some of it is access, particularly around behavioral mental health, which we know is a crisis, not just here in St. Louis, but nationally. But other things are more social issues. So in the St. Louis City, violence is one of the #1 issues. So you would think community health needs assessment, but they say it's gun violence. That's what's really challenging them to live or to have the opportunity to live their healthiest lives. Out in the county, it's a little bit different, but those are some of the ways. And certainly we have ongoing ways to try and understand what is challenging our communities, either through screening for social determinants of health or working with our community partners like IHN and our public health partners. That was really one of the benefits of going through the pandemic, is we all got to know each other. And so we all feel like we can pick up the phone and talk to each other now.
So when you do that kind of survey and something like gun violence rises to the very top, not really your bailiwick,
is
that when collaboration even broader collaboration
Yes,
becomes
absolutely.
even more essential.
Yes. So if you talk about the complexity of health, gun violence is also a very complex issue. It's not necessarily just about, people want to boil it down to, well, if we just got rid of guns, then everything would be fine. And I'm like, well, that's not going to happen tomorrow. So let's still consider that, but let's work on things that really create violence in the communities. And those are absolutely driven by poverty. And so if you want to solve gun violence, you can't just focus on the instrument. You have to focus on the environment. And so that means collaborating with other people, with politicians, with law enforcement, with other community organizations. So I'll just give you a small example. The Archbishop, so we're a Catholic healthcare organization. The Archbishop formed a gun violence task force a couple of years ago. I spoke at it. He invited me to serve on it. We had our meeting yesterday. And so this continues on. So you have to engage everybody in that, but it can't just be about law enforcement and prosecution, which is what inevitably people think it's about, but it's not. It is really about community development and offering opportunities so people don't choose violence. That is the key.
Karen, what does the data show us about cross-sector collaboration? Does it clearly show that it works?
I think it's actually such a big topic that you have to break it down a little smaller than that. I think what we have quite good data on are that cross-sector collaboration locally works incredibly well. That we have innumerable examples around the country where you have community-based partnerships, where you have a focus on, say, metabolic disease or hypertension, and groups can go in and help the community engage and get healthier. And we can see this in hospital-based care and community-based care. There's lots of good examples. The thing where I think we've failed to connect the dots are in bringing policy and business into that space. So we have a lot of brilliant minds in business who are thinking about the next device, the next drug, the next whatever way to make money, all of the things. And we don't have the connection of all of these brilliant minds, all of the McKinsey kids, thinking about how do we fundamentally shake up how we deliver healthcare. And so we've got community-based healthcare where people are doing God's work in being in the communities and doing the work. And then we've got a lot of money and policy and economics floating around up here that's fundamentally disconnected from getting the resources to where it needs to be. So we hunt and peck to try to find $10,000 for a community violence prevention grant, and we've got billions of dollars going into biotech.
Is there enough sharing of the data so people understand what's working and what's not?
I think we know, to some degree, we spend a lot of time reproving what we know to be effective, because it's harder to actually change the thing broadly. So I think we have enough data to show us that you need to go into the communities to improve hypertension. I think if we focus on hypertension and metabolic disease, we would save countless lives nationally. But we have that data. It's what we do with it and how we bring in, I think, policy in the business communities to really engage in this space. That link, I think, is broken.
How do you reestablish or establish that link?
Part of it is proving the business case. I mean, some of it is politics, and I'll stay away from politics because I don't think that's actually worth discussing right now. But I think you have to make the economic case for health. You have to make the case that keeping people healthy, and health is a public good. And it's a moral good also, but if you want to have the economic conversation, we can have that too. St. Louis will be better if we have less gun violence. St. Louis will be better if we have less metabolic disease. And you have to get people to the table who can control that kind of policy and money to recognize that it is a collective problem of health. That link, that communication for me is the most important one we need to work on.
So Karen didn't want to discuss politics, but I'm going to edge up. I'm going to edge up next to it. Resources are becoming more scarce. Does that make cross-sector collaboration even more crucial? Sophia.
Yes, period. I think at the IHN, one of our funding opportunities was through, the federal government, where we had community-based health workers, and that under the new administration, that grant was slashed. And so then if we don't have community health workers who are out in the community and interfacing with the population, interfacing with the people who have the most pressing needs, and then we don't have that relationship any longer with that institution that provided those funds for us, how do we continue to cultivate and establish and strengthen the work? So it absolutely hurts the cross-sector collaboration.
Dr. Gaza?
Yeah, no, completely. In fact, I think it makes it even more essential or even more needed. So I'm old enough to remember when we were in DC when sequestration was going on. And so nothing sharpens your pencil more than when somebody says, hey, we're going to take something away. And so then you have to start thinking, what is my core mission? Like, what do I absolutely, at the end of the day, what do I want to get done? Everything else can sort of fall to the wayside, you know, like to haves, but what do I need to have? And so in many ways, it does drive more collaboration when there is limited funding or limited economics.
Or are people even more incented to protect their rice balls?
I was going to say, I think it goes the exact opposite direction, unfortunately,
Okay.
which is to say that, at least at our health system, when times are tight, we are incented to go do more procedures. We are incented to go find more business. We are incented to, you know, to do all the things that are not necessarily about collaboration or about new partnerships, right? We are incented to get butts in chairs. And that, unfortunately, is still how the healthcare system is paid for, though we know that that is not what actually drives health. And so I think to some degree, this political moment, this economic moment, is making people retrench a bit into the way that we know how to make money in healthcare. And fundamentally, that's not where we need to be. We need to be in a new model of how we make money in healthcare. And I worry that this has been a retrenchment instead of a real innovative moment. I hope that there's a flip side to this where when lots of things have been destroyed, you can look and say, we actually could do this better. And we could do this better for health and for the, you know, sort of population health. I hope we get to that moment.
I would love to take some audience questions if somebody out there has one to ask.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you so much for being here. I was really interested in the discussion about hypertension and metabolic disease, the way that these can really destroy communities almost on a case-by-case basis. Improving patient outcomes can really be requiring of personalized and individualized treatments. So how can we leverage a cross-sectional collaboration even when we do have such case-by-case situations?
Who wants to grab that one?
I'm putting that on you.
Well, so I'll make a really brief comment. Yes, hypertension bad, right? And we know how to treat hypertension, and we know the risk factors. And so when you're thinking about this though from a community perspective, so we know what the proximal risks are for hypertension, right? So, you know, too much sodium, or you're overweight, or things like that. But what you really have to consider, in addition to that, is what are the more distal causes? So I don't think anybody wakes up in the morning going, gosh, I wish I had hypertension, right? They're saying, I have all of these other things that I have to, that compete with my time and my resources for me just to carry on my normal life in populations at risk, right? And those are the populations that are being disproportionately affected by hypertension. And so in addition to that proximal relationship that we have with the healthcare system, we also have to be incorporating that distal risk, which is why are they at risk for this disease? And that is a much harder problem to solve than, you know, giving an antihypertensive.
I mean, I think hypertension is sort of the classic collective action problem. We all turn through insurances so quickly that this is just not a priority for much of the healthcare system. But if you are Medicare, you should care deeply about hypertension. We're all going to end up on Medicare. We've made a community decision that at some point you age into socialized medicine. So if you are Medicare, you should care so much about hypertension. And yet, that's not how the system is set up. It's just sort of a classic collective action problem. But there's great data about cross-sector collaboration and team-based care to control hypertension. You actually don't need a doctor. For the vast majority of hypertension, you should stay away from doctors because they are not very good at managing your hypertension. But pharmacists and nurses are fantastic. Community health workers, essential. So there's great evidence, actually, for cross-sector collaboration for the vast majority of hypertension. Certainly some is more complex than that. But the vast majority, including the 60% of uncontrolled hypertension that are within 10 to 15 points of control, where we know what to do. We just have to solve the collective action problem that it's not sexy and it doesn't pay any money And so therefore, we don't have the kind of, I think, emphasis that we really need to for what is arguably a pandemic.
Goes back to that funding.
It does, it goes back to funding.
Do we have another question out there? Yes.
Yeah, hello. Kelly Bristow. I'm a registered dietitian with Bayer, so I'm really appreciating the conversation and thinking about
Dietitians too for hypertension, sorry.
Thank you. Yes, I had to give a little shout out. We're seeing a lot of community programming and a lot of pilots around food as medicine and insurance-funded food baskets and kind of reaching these food populations where they can't get access to things like fruits and vegetables. So we're often thinking, on the defense instead of on the offense. So I would love your opinion about maybe where we see healthcare supporting and actually getting reimbursed and helping the funding system from an insurance perspective on the proactive side instead of the defensive side. And also things like funding registered dietitians, getting reimbursed. It's really hard to get proactive reimbursement for registered dietitians. It's usually after we're already seeing hypertension, metabolic disease, severe obesity.
Thoughts?
Nice plug for dietitians there.
Yeah, I was going to say, you don't have
yes,
anything personally involved here, do you?
So we are doing work like that. So part of our social determinant of health screening is about food, transportation, housing, financial security, things like that. And at least at SSM, and I know other health care systems do this as well, we do have a food insecurity program where we have food pantries in all of our hospitals to send the patient home with 3 days worth of healthy food. But more importantly, we have an established link with here in St. Louis with the St. Louis Area Food Bank. And that creates a link, it's a warm handoff of, hey, we need you to follow this patient for the next 90 days to make sure that they're now getting a secure food source and getting access to whatever benefits they might be eligible for. The second question about the funding piece, I mean, it's hard to secure that kind of funding right now. You can't get reimbursed for it or anything like that. I mean, there's different waivers in different states depending upon where you live, but it's challenging. But I'll also digress down into this fundamental question is why do we have food insecurity in the first place? So all we're really doing is a shell game by saying, hey, healthcare, you should really take care of this, when really it should be a societal issue.
Do we have one more? Yes, I see at least one hand.
My name's Henry Warshaw. I'm a trustee of Washington University. All these discussions have been great. I'm just curious as to why there's been a lack of discussion about artificial intelligence helping in any of these areas.
I think there's immense opportunity for AI to help. I think in the healthcare system, there's a tremendous amount of administrative waste, right? Say 15 to 20%, depending on sort of how you think about it. A lot of that could be addressed with AI, and there's a lot of just waste, right? That's not going toward patient care. That's not going. So that to me is part of what needs to make the system better. Cross-sector collaboration with AI, I think, is a little bit trickier because we have an enormous digital divide between who even has access to the data, let alone to the AI part of it. If we could integrate AI into data systems to be able to help us figure out, who to get to and when, and things like that, I think it would be immensely helpful. But we have some work to do before that to even have data and data systems that really reflect the reality of health, not the sort of high-end healthcare bits, right? We can see MI data around the country or CAR T treatment for cancer. We can find those data, but finding hypertension and things like that where you might need sort of big data tools to understand interventions, I think is a little bit trickier.
I would like to wrap up here by asking each one of you, if you had the power to reform the system to promote more cross-sector collaboration, what's the one thing you would do first, either in terms of building something or tearing something down? Sophia, you want to go first?
I'm smiling because that's where my mind went first, to tear it down. But I know that's probably not the most productive thing to do. But sometimes I do wonder, what would it look like for us to just completely start over and to reposition the right people in the right places that have that moral good, because that's kind of like where my mind and heart sort of leans toward more, is what it would it look like for us to all have a better moral compass where we're really not caring about our rice bowls, but we're really caring about the people, and we're really caring about just the collective impact and the collective action to really mobilize and stabilize our region. So honestly, I would say let's tear it down, or maybe transform or reimagine what our systems look like, or could look like.
Karen?
I would tear down the RVU-based model of care and rebuild it with something much more focused on cross-sector care delivery with team-based care to help keep people healthy.
Dr. Garza?
Yeah, I completely agree with my fellow panelists here. And I'll just throw a couple of things out there. We're the only economically developed country that doesn't have a public option for healthcare. We spend X times more on healthcare and have poorer outcomes. And that correlation alone should mean something to you. And so if you were going to start all over again, I don't think anybody would have designed the system. This is like, you put a bunch of marbles in a jar and scattered it around and saw what came out. So focusing, though, on health instead of health care, I think, is extremely important.
Thank you all. Appreciate it so much. Thank you.
We will now take a 10-minute break. Please participate in our new polling question by scanning the QR code on the screens.
Please take your seats. The program will begin momentarily. Please take your seats. The program will begin momentarily. The program will begin in 5 minutes. Please take your seats. The program will begin momentarily. Please take your seats. The program will begin momentarily. Please take your seats. The program will begin momentarily. Please take your seats. The program will begin momentarily. Please welcome to the stage Managing Director of Health at Washington University's Olin Business School, Patrick Aguilar.
And thank you for what a wonderful morning we already had. As you heard, I'm Patrick Aguilar. I'm the Managing Director of Health at Olin Business School, and it's my privilege to get to curate conversations like these and think with people around the school, around the university, and around the community about how we can make impact on the biggest problems we have, such as those in health. You know, leaders create impact wherever they are. And then some of the people in the room are executives at large firms. Some people are launching startups. Some people are students. And one of the things that we really pride ourselves on at Olin is the ability to engage with all of these different kinds of audiences to help leverage our scholarship and our teaching to improve the intentionality around the way these people will create impact. And today I'm really particularly energized by the idea that we're engaging in those conversations together, both with excellent panelists and with the conversations you're having in the hall about how to do just that. So thank you again for being here. Now, many of you just took a poll, and we'll have the poll results show up. And I want to make the point, for those of you who've taken a class with me, you know that poll questions are actually pedagogical moments, so we'll use that a little bit that way now. We asked this question, and I'll be candid, I expected this partnering with academics answer to be the bottom. We've obviously primed you well to make that the response that you entered into. But the point that I want to make with this poll and with each answer is that these are interconnected and really interdependent ideas. There are ways that we in a business school and across the broader university can partner with industry to advance commercial interests. There are ways that we can partner to advance personal development interests. And there are ways that we can partner to help advance the level that we're all thinking together. When we start to collaborate in the way that these conversations are designed to help us do, we get insights on opportunities, gaps, and policy needs that we would miss if we stayed in our own silos. When we collaborate, we get new tools for operational leadership that help us optimize, improve, and sustain care delivery. And ultimately, that's how we get solutions. That's how we solve the toughest challenges that we face as a country, both in this industry and really across industries. So it's my pleasure to be here with you today. I'm enjoying it. I hope you are too. I'm really excited about what we have the rest of the morning. Thank you for the great conversations, and we'll get back to it. Thank you.
For a conversation produced by our underwriter, Olin Business School, on Ownership Matters, Aligning Health Investment Models with Value and Outcomes, please welcome Jesse Hunter, Healthcare Operating Partner at Welsh, Carson, Anderson & Stowe, Aaron Chrisman, Vice President, Clinical Innovation at One Oncology, with Ryan McDevitt, Professor of Economics at Washington University Olin Business School and School of Public Health.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. A really engaging discussion so far. Keep it going right now, and we haven't had this obligatory fact yet. We've got about 1/5 of our economy right now dedicated to the healthcare sector. Just a staggering statistic. We're an outlier compared to everywhere else in the world. And we do things a little differently in the US, as I'm sure we've all noticed. We have a wide range of ownership types in the United States. We have academic medical centers like here, we're for-profit, some other nonprofits. The government, of course, plays a large role. How should we think about that when we're trying to promote value and getting the most for our dollars of the healthcare systems? We've also seen a lot of consolidation over the past few decades, and most of that is from small independent clinics being integrated with larger systems. And what do these clinics look for a capital partner? What are the key factors that matter to them?
So, like you said, there's been this pretty impressive move from independent medicine 25, 30 years ago, where 3/4 of physicians were in an independent setting, to today it's about 20-25%. So it's in a very short time has moved from a place where most were independent to now being involved with at least some kind of business entity owning you or employing you. So, so I work for a company called One Oncology, which is a management services organization. And so we partner with independent oncology practices. When we have discussions with them, it's mostly about their independence, right? Like they want to maintain that independence. It's getting harder and harder in this healthcare environment for an independent physician to remain independent because their pay is going down. Medicare pay has been going down for a long, long time. Costs of goods keep going up. Their competitors, which are typically health systems or Optums of the world, are hugely capitalized, so it's hard to compete against them. And so I think mostly what they're looking for is an opportunity for themselves to remain independent and to be able to keep doing what they're doing, be close to home, retain their autonomy and their identity in the local environment. And so that's what MSOs like our company do, and some, but not all, are PE-backed. PE being the kind of the mechanism for allowing those practices to gain the capital to compete with health systems.
But Jesse, what are some of the key trade-offs here? I didn't hear much about the trade-offs of partnering with one of these large financial sponsors.
Yeah. First of all, thanks for the opportunity to be here. I think we talk about the business of health. In a lot of cases, we don't really talk about the administration of health, so the other side of that business. And the part of the trade-off is how much time is allocated into clinic and seeing patients and all the things that people got into medicine to do, versus what has to be done to run a business and be sustainable with respect to that. So I think part of the determination at the individual and at the practice level, where do people want to spend their time, and what do they value, and how does that get allocated? If you're independent, you don't have any choice, right? But to have a meaningful amount of that allocation into the sustainability of the practice and retaining jobs and all the other things, in addition to value at the patient level. If you make a choice to partner with somebody else, then you can kind of reallocate that. But in conjunction with that, you are giving up a lot of that independence and the decision-making authority that you would otherwise have. There are, I think in any of these larger institutions, you kind of move towards bureaucracy. So whether that's reporting or, the kind of whatever the management protocols that exist, that absolutely would be the case as you move outside of the independence. And I mean, I'd say the only other consideration that we see from time to time is generational. So we have people that are have been practicing for an extended period of time. What happens? Like where do we go from here? And in some cases there is not a natural kind of succession within an organization. So you really need to have kind of a catalyst for how the institution is going to be preserved into the future.
We'll stay on this thread for a minute then. When you're rolling up these independent clinics, how do you get them to align with what you're doing as the larger platform? What are some key things that you try to implement?
Yeah. I will just caveat that roll-ups are kind of one feature. So there's a lot of different kinds of transactions that exist, and I think there's been probably mixed results on a number of different types of kind of private investments. But I think if you're starting kind of with the basics, where to Aaron's point, where is there kind of need and opportunity within a particular kind of specialty or a particular category where there are benefits of scale, and there's enough that can be leveraged in terms of purchasing power or administrative leverage, et cetera. But I think one of the common denominators and probably the most important starting point is what is the underlying quality of the care that's being delivered within that institution. So nobody's going to try to consolidate, certainly people that I'm familiar with, are going to try to consolidate and improve, right, the underlying care. You really want to kind of reward high quality care as opposed to trying to change practice kind of behaviors and patterns at that level. I think even outside of kind of the kind of clinic consolidation, things along those lines. I think, spend most of my career in kind of the investment in healthcare businesses, and when you buy a thing and try to get it to be something else, I've never seen that work. And so I think the starting point is what is the quality, what is the team? So who are the people that you're really investing in? I know there was an earlier panel where there was conversation, particularly at the venture stage. This is somewhat about idea and a lot about team. Exactly the same case here. So what's the quality of the clinical team, and then how do you bring some leverage to that and create the focus that we were talking about a second ago?
Does that resonate with you, Aaron?
Yeah, I think that last point really resonates with me about the management team. I think that there is some villainizing of private equity, I think, in a lot of healthcare investments, but it's a two-sided coin, right? The PE is a financial mechanism, and a very important one, I think, right now for private physicians and for a lot of innovation that happen in other sectors. But there's that side, and then there's the management side, team side, and it really is dependent on them to maintain what should be the quality of care, the mission of the organization, and when done well, it can be really, really fruitful.
Well, so on that note of private equity, we've had about $1 trillion of investment over the past decade, outsized impact on the healthcare system. And the headlines, as you noted, are almost exclusively negative when it comes to private equity and healthcare, but the academic evidence is not showing that. It's much more nuanced. So why do you think we've seen such a growth in private equity investment over the past decade or so?
Sure. So I think Jesse will probably have better points, I think, outside of like my experience is really on the physician side, and kind of back to my earlier statements, the growth in that area has been one of just need, right? So independent physicians need capital to compete with larger organizations so that they can maintain their autonomy, and there's only certain places that you can get that capital. And so private equity has been an alternative to just being absorbed by a health system, right? So.
Yeah, I think if we take a little bit of a step back, and this, fortunately, this theme came up in a couple of the other panels. We're in the context of like what we know is a very high cost and relatively lower value. So we wish we had more for the 20% of the economy that's being invested into healthcare. So that is a very compelling, there's a lot of kind of momentum towards status quo within the current system. And so much of that kind of industry power is concentrated in payers, in the systems, in pharma, et cetera. There is a tremendous amount of incentive to preserve that dynamic within the industry. So there is the question of where is the innovation and disruption going to come from, particularly in the context of the kind of the risk profile, risk tolerance, and kind of some of these things that were raised in, I think, the first panel. So I think that's part of the role for the private capital broadly is there is no incentive really for the existing institutions to invest in disruption and kind of improvement in the same way. I think that's part of the catalyst for kind of private equity as like an asset class, if you will. I think within healthcare, there is a tremendous amount of opportunity to do all the things that everybody wants. Improve access, improve quality outcomes, improve experience, particularly at the patient level, and ultimately do that in a more cost-effective way. But that can be generated and kind of, I think, funded and led in many ways by these the other institutions that are providing that capital. But I think it's important to note that there's the financing part of the kind of the equation here, so money that's coming from kind of private equity, but we should distinguish that from governance. So how are these organizations actually led? And what role kind of the financial institution plays, and what role kind of the management and board play. And I think in every organization, like, management and board is going to be more important than financing in terms of how decisions ultimately get made.
Well, I need to push back a little bit because all the headlines are about private equity's focus purely on slashing costs, increasing prices. But I'm hearing a little bit from both of you that innovation is also a key aspect of this. Do you have any specific examples you can point to where that's been a large driver from private equity?
Yeah, I think so. In my organization, we've some of it is innovation by necessity, I guess. So I think a big area that has become a need for anybody in healthcare, right, is around cybersecurity. There's been plenty of attacks on all kinds of large and small institutions. We've had practices that had pretty significant cyber terrorism attacks prior to being a part of our platform. And it's expensive and difficult to do that, I think, at a small level. And so that's one of the benefits of aggregating is that you can get access to software engineers and all of these other kind of cyber attack kind of softwares. And so like we've seen that be very beneficial. Another necessity, kind of in the same vein, was the Change Healthcare thing. So that not only was, there's various problems there, but cash flow was a big issue for our practices. And based on our model and having kind of PE kind of consistently backing the cash flow, we could protect our practices from pretty negative outcomes in terms of like being able to be payroll and things like that. The thing that I'm more excited about is really about expansion of therapies that tend to exist mostly in academic centers. So I've had a longer history in cell therapy. I worked in academics before and launched a couple CAR-T programs. And those have been around for 8 years now in a commercial space and have largely not made it outside of academic medical centers. There's this huge access need. 80% of patients that might be eligible for those therapies aren't getting them. There's a lot of reasons for that, but we're tackling right now, how do we get this into more community settings? We launched our first program with Tennessee Oncology last year. We're looking at probably 4 to 5 more CAR-T programs in the community. So, our goal is to get access to, including for therapies that are typically more tertiary or quaternary, to local community settings. And it's hard to do that without capital, one, and for something like CAR-T that costs $500,000 a dose, the cash flow kind of protections. So we've done it with CAR-T. We're now looking at radiopharmaceuticals and how we do it in that space. So that's kind of like the more exciting, innovative thing is like, how do we influence care delivery and kind of spread out things that were innovative at an academic medical center, but how do we get it to more patients?
Yeah, I think I'll just maybe go a little bit broader on the kind of at the industry level. It's hard to paint with too broad a brush when you're talking about an entire category, and like any industry, there's a normal distribution of participants, and there are a bunch of people who are kind of making investments, kind of private capital investments into these companies that want to do the right thing and are doing a good job, and there's people at both ends of the spectrum that are doing either really well or doing it really poorly. So but I think when you look at it in aggregate, one of the things the industry has really done a terrible job is telling its story around quality. And I think there has been, in the absence of that story, that's when you have a bunch of these other kind of the visibility on what's going wrong, or assessing kind of the reason that these assets are underperforming with the ownership, role of private equity, et cetera. So I think it's something that has been a big focus over the last number of years at the individual company level. What are the outcomes that people can, in the data that people can share in a transparent fashion to demonstrate where quality of care improvements have been made. Moving that, then I think it's kind of the stage we're in now, is the firms who are more focused on healthcare are really thinking about how do we transparently report quality information across the portfolio, not only to kind of like the limited partners and kind of people that are in and around the firm, but like more broadly into like participating in kind of partnering with institutions like WashU or others to help validate and really prove is this making a difference kind of in one direction or the other. But then ultimately I think that needs to be owned at the industry level. So there's actually not just playing defense with respect to like things that are going wrong, and there are undeniably some bad outcomes that have happened in a number of situations, particularly in some of these roll-ups of nursing facilities, things along those lines that are just terrible to see and hear about, and clearly cast a shadow across the industry. So what are the alternatives? Like what's the narrative around and the evidence around all the other things where the companies have gotten growth capital and have really taken a good model and been able to expand that, and how many whether it's diseases that have been curative or patients that have been served, pick the right metric that is much more relevant kind of for the broader public when we think about outcomes, and make sure that that's out there.
Yeah, we have to be clear, the stakes are incredibly high. We're talking about patients' lives at stake. And so I think there's a direct line between these really negative outcomes where you see a hospital system closing down, and the claim is it's because private equity stripped all the assets away, And now we're starting to see regulations, which California, Oregon have all passed legislation targeted specifically at private equity. So what guardrails should we have in place then as a system, and what role do we have in advancing that discussion?
Yeah. Sorry to go back to back here. I think it is an interesting question. You've certainly seen the markets that you referenced that it has a direct effect on how companies are thinking about investing in those communities. I think my view, and obviously Aaron can share his. I do think it's dangerous to have different views of quality based on kind of the investor category. So we should have a very high, consistently high standard of quality for all of the companies that are participating in a particular kind of category, so industry, geography, et cetera. I think there is an opportunity, frankly, like for the whether it's through policy or otherwise, to use participation from private equity, et cetera, to raise the bar for everybody. So like what are the metrics that are important for quality for that stakeholder or for that community? And how do we create some transparency and consistency around how those are reported across categories? So like what is the performance for a private equity owned kind of business? What is the same quality for an independently owned business or a hospital-owned business? Like pick your category. But I think I think we would all benefit. I think the system at large would benefit for more consistency and transparency on quality, irrespective of ownership.
Yeah, and I think there's already a fair amount of regulation out there, kind of around at least some of this, with corporate practice of medicine laws that exist in 30 of 50 states or something like that, and there are more of those coming out all the time. I think to Jesse's point, they are the more recent laws that have been out there are very targeted at private equity, and targeted in a way that's throwing the baby out with the bathwater a little bit. Because it's so specific, and it doesn't account for any of the good things that can happen with a capital partner like PE. So I think that regulation will exist. It's about doing it in a way that maintains the positive aspects and also allows us to create a system that does reward and influence kind of quality.
Well, thank you. 20 minutes goes by way too fast.
Yeah,
So
it does.
we'll have to continue this discussion later. But thank you all.
Yes.
Here to discuss Beyond the Lab, Making Breakthroughs Reach People, please welcome Joel Bronstein, President and CEO of C2N Diagnostics, Stavros Zanos, Associate Professor, Feinstein Institutes for Medical Research at Northwell Health, with Jean Meserve, contributor at Atlantic Live.
So there is a lot of great research going on at universities all across the country, but too often it's staying there and it is not getting commercialized, so it can be used by other researchers, other universities, and the public, which may need some of this medical technology. We're going to discuss why this happens. Joel, I'd love to start with you. You just told me that it took 13 years for C2N's Alzheimer's test to get to market. 13 years. What were the principal obstacles?
So first of all, it's a real pleasure to be here, and you might be asking, well, what have they been doing for 13 years? When we started the company back in 2007, it was based on really remarkable work that came out of the Washington University School of Medicine, Department of Neurology. And so you have all the early enthusiasm and extraordinary excitement that comes with a new idea and say, hey, we're going to commercialize this, and in 2 years we'll be on the market. But science and translational work in the corporate setting doesn't necessarily always work that way. You need a lot of different stakeholders to come together, and the macro environment also has to be conducive to introducing tests. So in the early days, we had an extraordinary platform for being able to look at biological markers in the brain using cerebrospinal fluid, but there was no analytical platform that was developed at that point to actually be able to do blood testing. So you had an analytical platform challenge. There were a tremendous number of scientific questions that over the last decade we have been able to learn about Alzheimer's disease and related forms of neurodegeneration that have had a tremendous impact on helping us to understand how to even go about developing a test. When you develop a test, how are you presenting that information to the patient? What is the customer need? And when we talk about customers, we're talking about payers, that being Medicare primarily. We're talking about healthcare professionals, and we're talking ultimately about the patients and the caregivers. A lot of variables that go into it, and it took that long to work through all of those elements.
So you say you learned a lot in the process, a lot of foundational stuff that was important to what you were developing. So if you were going to start the process again today, would it take 13 years or something less?
It would not. Largely because you have trailblazers who have helped establish new pathways and understandings as to how to develop. And so sometimes people say, oh, well, it's better to be second as opposed to first. And I think from our experience, we were first. But then people ask me the question, well, you've dedicated 18 years of your life. I trained in cardiovascular medicine, and you've spent 18 years. Tell me about that experience. I wouldn't change what we've done at any point in the history. I mean, we've made mistakes, but you learn from those mistakes. And we wouldn't be where we are today without all of that work. And when you actually, another just kind of high-level comment, and then I'll stop. When you look at the organizations that are really transforming Alzheimer's disease treatment and management and diagnostics today, it's actually the companies and organizations that have been in it for the long haul. Eli Lilly has been committed to Alzheimer's disease, trying to innovate there for many, many years, decades. Eisai, Biogen, Roche, companies like C2N Diagnostics. It's actually not a chance circumstance that those are the organizations that have really been leading the way.
Stavros, you've been doing neuroscience research within the university for quite a while. What are the obstacles that research institutions put up that make it difficult to commercialize?
There are many. One of them is administration. Researchers today spend a lot of their time, a big chunk of their time, doing administrative work, which is a bit odd because we have so many people in administration. We still have to be involved, heavily involved with it. We have to train students, postdocs, fellows, residents. We have to be part of the ecosystem of academia, which means we have to sit in committees, we have to review grants and papers. So it's really a lack of time on one side. The other big component to this is lack of funding, which eventually translates into needing more time to apply for funding, to get funding, to spend less time doing discovery work. And I would say you really need both of those. You need the time to think deeply about these difficult problems and also funding to be able to bring these ideas into a more mature state.
Do you think that universities need to develop more infrastructure to support commercialization? And do they need to build skills amongst researchers that help them become entrepreneurs?
That's an excellent point. I think they do, and they are already working on it. That's my impression, at least. I guess academic research is always changing, but I could see the obvious changes in the last several years. And that comes also from funding agencies like the NIH. They put a lot more emphasis on translational work, meaning work that will be used to treat diseases or diagnose diseases, even at the beginning stages of that research. So the institutions are aligning to that. They encourage this type of work. They make it easier to some extent for clinicians, physicians to get into the research enterprise, provide their input or lead labs themselves, which is a big deal, I think, especially in the translational space, bringing scientific ideas to clinical fruition. You need physicians and other healthcare providers to be part of this discussion as early on as possible.
Joel, when you were discussing the things that slowed you down, you didn't really mention the FDA. And I'm fascinated to know about how much that process of creating and executing clinical trials, how exhausting that is and how time-consuming that is, and whether that's stalling commercialization.
Yeah, so it's a great question. I actually have a tremendous number of positive things to say about the FDA and our interactions. I think that, there maybe from like an outsider's view, there might be this perception that it's a huge administrative organization with a lot of different maybe inefficiencies at some level. But the people that we've worked with, and it's individuals, right? So we're working with people, not an agency per se, are really intelligent, really committed to the public health
Are they still
imperative.
working there?
So that great question. It depends on exactly what the requirements and the tasks are being performed. So when you look actually at drug product reviews and medical device product reviews, two of the major divisions are the pharmacologics group and then the medical devices and radiological health. The review teams who are responsible for reviewing applications are mostly intact from our experience. And you might say, well, that's interesting, given significant government cuts and trying to improve efficiencies. One of the elements of FDA, which has actually worked quite well for industry, is this MDUFA and PDUFA fees that are largely paid for by pharmaceutical companies and medical device organizations that are actually the ones whose products are getting reviewed. Therefore, because the budget is coming from the private sector, that helps to maintain some of the efficiencies. So we actually were able to submit our product that's now under FDA review a few days before October 1st. And you say, well, could there be some delays there? We've received confirmation that the review team has received that application. It's checked in before October 1, and the review will go as planned. And we're also being reviewed as a breakthrough device product because it addresses an urgent unmet medical need, has potential for having a dramatic impact on patient outcomes. And because of that prioritization, it is getting the proper attention. But it's a complex process filing these devices and therapeutic products, and that
Should it be
was a lengthy
streamlined?
process.
Can it be simplified?
I think it can definitely be streamlined. I think from our perspective, because we're in an area of such unmet medical need, focused on trying to develop novel strategies for diagnosis and even treatment, we've been able to get some special considerations as like breakthrough device products. We actually were involved with the development of a therapy that wound up going into early stage clinical trials. We were able to use a very innovative pathway there. So I think the challenge is like awareness of saying, what is the clinical solution that we're trying to solve? The field may not necessarily need more Me Too type products. That is good for competition. It's good for lowering prices. So from an economic perspective, makes a lot of sense. But when we talk about real medical breakthroughs and really transforming clinical care for these patients, where it's still a major problem, the ability to think boldly and to think about advancing an idea will create some avenues for being able to take advantage of programs that have been set by the federal government to allow for some of that innovation.
Stavros, I'm curious from your perspective whether you think there needs to be closer collaboration or at least conversation between universities where the research is taking place and industry.
Right. Well, the industry of healthcare, big part of it are the hospitals. So I'm glad you asked this question because where I work, it's part of Northwell Health. It's a big health system in New York. Our research institute is actually supported by Northwell Health. And because of that support, Northwell Health has stakes in and much interest in seeing us succeed. So we have this conversation on a very regular basis with the hospitals, with the corporate offices of Northwell Health. It's a very interesting model because it provides funding that is directly tied to translational research that the health system cares about. So they have input to it. They care about the products of research. And hopefully they see the long-term investment payoff.
Do they direct your research? Do they tell you what they want you to be investigating?
It's not this kind of conversation.
Okay.
I think most of the time we spend with them is getting them to understand what they're doing, what the value is there. Obviously, the topics we choose are, the process for deciding what to work on is quite complex. It has to do with your background, with the opportunity, with the funding environment, obviously with the clinical need. But I think what they are trying to do, at least in our case, is try to see the potential for transformation, because they're large enough to care about the bigger societal impact. It's not just it's going to help their clinics or 1 or 2 hospitals. They are like 28 hospitals and thousands of clinics.
I do a lot of work in the national security space, and in that area I hear a lot about the valley of death, where there are all these promising startups who may have a great idea and then they can't get the money to commercialize it. And within the national security space, a number of entities have been created that try to shepherd startups through that phase. In the healthcare field, are similar sorts of mechanisms or institutions being set up?
So I have some experience from federal funders, federal sponsors, NIH, ARPA-H, DARPA. I have been funded by them. What I will say is that there is definitely a shift towards getting products and ideas through this valley of death. This is real help to a lot of smaller startups that or maybe because their products or their ideas are a bit on the revolutionary side, it wouldn't be that easy for them to seek private funding. So I see real value of the NIH, the DARPA, and all of these federal funders coming in and taking companies through that valley of death.
I mean, I do think that in uncertain times, and if you're an investor, you like to be able to predict your risk. And for early stage companies, that's always been the issue. And when you think about bold ideas that take a long time to develop, in the case of C2N Diagnostics, we're 18 years in. And so we feel like we're just getting started. That's not really conducive to a limited partnership in a venture capital fund. And so the question is, like, how do you fill that gap, as you talked about? And so it's addressing areas of unmet clinical need. That will bring out different stakeholders who have a special interest. The C2N Diagnostics has been blessed to be able to work so closely with Washington University School of Medicine, which has tremendous resources, even with the entrepreneurial community, and the ability to have that crosstalk with other groups who have been through that. There's a lot of foundation support into both the university, and we've been benefactors of that, where one of our foundations, who's an investor in C2N Diagnostics, has actually put in $50 million. So again, what is it about that foundation that was so important for them to be able to support us? GHR Foundation has actually been a supporter of Washington University and some of the amazing work that's going on in the Department of Neurology. And so if you can find an aligned vision and long-term goal to make a big difference, it takes time to try to find those sources, but they do exist. But you have to be creative.
If each of you could give a few tips to founders and researchers who are in this translational danger zone, what would they be? Stavros?
I mean, it would help a lot if you have deep pockets, not you, the founder, necessarily, but the people who are around you.
But that would help too.
I mean, really, it's a long game, and people run out of cash before they get to these milestones that are required to make their product viable. But also, I would say, because I have seen this in several cases, be open to exploring opportunities that are not obvious for funding. For example, the federal government. I know it sounds odd.
Even now, I mean, NIH has had its funding cut, for instance.
Yeah, it's a very challenging time, the last 10 months or whatever, but I think overall, because there is this clear shift from, and we see it every day, from foundational and basic science into more translational science. I think there are lots of good opportunities for, it's not going to be $50 million grants, but it might be a $5 million grant or a $1 million grant at different stages of the development. Be open to exploring these opportunities. There are a lot of them, and for several cases that I have witnessed, it worked really well.
Your tips?
If I could sum it up in 3 words, it would be passion, patience, and persistence. Don't take no for an answer. You will get turned down many different times, whether it's asking for resources and funding, being able to pursue a specific scientific idea. The passion, it is absolutely essential to have people that believe in the vision and mission of what you're trying to do. Again, we've been fortunate to have 2 pioneers in the field of Alzheimer's disease over at Washington University School of Medicine, David Holtzman and Randy Bateman, who are co-founders in this company, who are absolutely, they've dedicated their entire career to understanding the basic mechanisms of Alzheimer's disease and then how they can think. They also are clinicians. They know what the patients are going through. And so having that passion, which I also share, have been in this game for 18 years, the belief that we're making a difference, that's critical. And then the persistence is just, if you believe in what you're doing and you have credible foundational work that supports it, there are people who will buy into that.
We have time for some questions. Do we have some out there in the audience? Looking for hands? Did I see a hand go up over here, or was that just a motion?
Hi, thank you.
Here we go.
Great presentation. I'm thinking specifically within translational research, one of the hottest topics across a wide variety of diseases is drug repurposing. And part of the reason it's really difficult to get drug repositioning out of the academic space and into mainstream, mainstream consumption is because it's deemed not profitable. And I'm sure that's true of other translational approaches, especially to novel niche diseases. So I'm curious how you've encountered that, and then how you are working to get treatment approaches that may not seem profitable out of the lab and to the bedside.
Well, I have an example from Northwell Health and Feinstein, a company that was founded by Feinstein CEO, Kevin Tracy. It's called SetPoint. I think the company was founded 15 years ago. The idea behind this company was that if you stimulate the nervous system with this tiny microchip, you can control how the immune system works. You can suppress inflammation and chronic diseases like rheumatoid arthritis. So the biology was there from almost 20, 25 years ago, but then it took, I would say, 15 years to get to a point where they just announced the positive results of a clinical trial. It was a very, I lived through the last 7 years. That's when I moved to New York. It was a very painful process. In the beginning, they were working with shoestring budgets. They were trying to, patch ideas left and right to get through the valley of death. And I think that speaks about volumes about the perseverance and the persistence. The vision was there, the biology was there. They all believed in this really novel way of treating chronic disease. And I don't know, somehow reality in the end prevails. The reality was that this treatment works. It went through all of the steps of preclinical testing to early clinical trials to the results, the positive results of the randomized control trial. It just takes longer, and it takes a lot more solid and persistent vision. But I think in the end, if the biology is there and the clinical benefit is there, I think it will work out in the end.
Do we have another question? I'm sorry, the lights are challenging me. Okay, I do see that we have one here.
So thank you for your discussion. I have a question especially for Joe. Diagnosis is very challenging. Alzheimer's disease diagnosis is even challenging. The challenge is coming from all different perspectives. like for Alzheimer's disease, several years ago, there's no effective therapies. Plus, you have probably you got a lot of questions asked about the payer coverage all the time. So how can you like survive through this field and deal with all those questions? That's the question I really want to know from your perspective.
There's a lot of scars to show, and we're still fighting that battle. But it's a great, where to begin. I mean, there's some high-level, the way in which the health system is organized. 85% of all dementia diagnoses in the U.S. are made in primary care. And when you look at the conventional tools that historically have been used for biomarker confirmation of Alzheimer's disease, they're highly specialized. Lumbar punctures, not routine procedures that primary care performs. Access to specialized PET imaging. So the first issue is the way in which the system is designed. And there's, 4, 5, 600,000 healthcare professionals that deal with primary care. And maybe 5% of that are specialists who have the capabilities. So you have massive bottlenecks. And we've actually been heavily involved in characterization of what misdiagnosis looks like in Alzheimer's disease. We published a paper in JAMA last year in July, which has been really kind of a landmark paper where we were able to demonstrate actually with using usual care processes, primary care for people who presented with early cognitive concerns had a 37% misdiagnosis rate. You say, well, let's go over to a specialist who specializes in Alzheimer's disease diagnosis. 25 to 30% misdiagnosis. And then I ask, from cardiovascular disease, in what area of medicine, whether cardiology or oncology or other, are we willing to accept a 25 to 40% misdiagnosis rate? And lo and behold, you start deploying these biomarkers, you can actually reduce that misdiagnosis to less than 10%, and we'll get to a point where it's less than 5%. So I think that there's, you just have to educate, tremendous amount of education, and then you do have to just continue to work with health systems and other organizations to demonstrate the value of what you're providing. And one of the key areas of focus for C2N today is actually building that value-based argument that we can actually save money as well as improve outcomes through earlier diagnosis. And so that's the challenge. And we can go into a lot more detail on that, but thank you for your question.
Do we have another one out there? I've got a couple more, if I don't see a hand.
Hello, thank you so much for your talks. I just wanted to, I'm in the middle over here.
Thank you. I'm challenged.
Yeah, no worries. A couple months ago, so the examples I'm naming are particular within the vaccine space, but I guess in general within the pharmaceutical space. Like companies like Moderna, for example, had about like $760 million worth of contracts canceled for singular vaccines that they were developing and testing. And even here at WashU, there was a cancer vaccine, mRNA vaccine trial that was going on that was paused indefinitely because of the grant cuts as well. So it's affecting both academia, industry, and obviously the changes in government. What is keeping investors and research scientists going or like optimistic in times like these? And another question I have sort of as an adjunct to it, what is preventing them to move to markets that may be more stable, such as the European Union?
Quick answer.
I can give a very brief answer to the first question. And the answer is I'm, and most people in our area are optimistic that in the end, ideas and products that seem to work and seem to promise a positive impact in people's lives, whether it's the federal government, whether it's a very wealthy individual that is willing to invest, whether it's a foundation, there will be a way to get it into where it needs to be to help people. If we didn't really create biology, we discover it, and when multiple people, multiple labs see that there is something of value somewhere, this will eventually grow up and become reality.
I want to wrap up by asking you each again. You have the opportunity to shift the landscape, what would you do? What's the number one thing you do to make it easier to move research out of the lab and into our health system?
You want to go first?
I would urge large health system, hospitals, to look closer into the transformational potential of translational research and become partners in it. I think it's an interesting idea. It's not something that I see happening very often, but because they are the end users, the hospitals and the health system, their physicians are the end users. I feel they should be a lot closer to these initial stages of discovery and not just guide it and shape it, but also help it to grow.
I think this topic of incentive alignment is so critically important that we have to enable scientists, translational researchers, clinicians to be willing to take risks and reap the rewards of that as part of a team. And academic centers in any organization has financial pressures, so they look at what are the main drivers to bring in revenues. But there needs to, if we really want to focus on innovation and continue that engine, which is the lifeblood of new therapies and diagnostics that get to patients, it does come from academia. You have to be able to continue rewarding the researchers who are doing such critically important work.
Thank you both today for your conversation. And to all our panelists, I think a lot of ideas have been put on the table. Hopefully all of you can take these ideas, mull them over, and perhaps come up with some solutions to some of the challenges faced on bringing medicine and business together to improve all our health. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Ooh, I've got a shoe mishap. Thank you all for attending our Business of Health event. We'd like to say thank you to all our speakers for lending their voices to today's important conversations. Lastly, thank you to our underwriter, Washington University's Olin Business School, for their support of today's event. Please join us for lunch in the Frick reception area, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you all for coming.